Thanks very much. We'll now move on to the next phase. I thank very much our team for this. I hope you all found this useful. Was it driving? And thank you very much for the teams. At the very opening yesterday morning, I challenged all of you that we were serious about breakthroughs, and those of you who didn't break through would have to leave. No one has to leave. We're very proud. I hope you'll constitute the core of this new movement in cybersecurity. It's now my pleasure to invite up for a challenge Governor Tom Ridge. I think all of you know of him. He's a man whose career has spanned being a governor, being Secretary of Homeland Security, being head of his own private successful firm. And we're very glad he's going to come up and share a challenge for us before the final keynote address.
Thanks, John. Thank you, John. It's really a great pleasure to join you and the distinguished group of men and women you've assembled here for the past couple of days. I want to thank everyone at the East-West Institute for the opportunity to join such a distinguished group. It truly is a privilege and a pleasure for me to do so. I do want to, if I might take a moment of personal privilege, though, I know one of my dear friends, General Harry Radke, has been very, very much involved in this. I want to thank him for his vision and his energy and leadership for helping and working with the East-West Institute to pull this. Done a remarkable job. Great couple of days. Thank you, Harry. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I realize that I don't bring necessarily the same deep professional subject matter expertise that all of you necessarily brought to this debate and these discussions. However, I hope I can bring a point of view that is provocative, appropriate, and helpful. My views on cybersecurity and the global challenges associated with a virtually connected, interconnected world really first converged when President George Bush called me to Washington for my position as governor of Pennsylvania to lead our homeland security efforts. Shortly after my arrival at the White House, we sought to tap some of the best and brightest cyber minds, both inside and outside of government, to craft a cybersecurity strategy, one that would simply begin to build in protections across the federal spectrum of data systems and information sharing channels. One of our previous speakers, Howard Schmidt, President Obama's cyber czar, was one of those individuals critically important to that effort. I admit the initial effort was rudimentary. It was certainly not enough. But it was vitally important and sorely needed, and frankly, you got to begin somewhere. And that's where we began. And as we look back at how we viewed this issue 8 or 9 years ago, I don't think there was an international or domestic sense of urgency to tackle the cyber threat that may exist today. I don't think we looked at it necessarily just a few short years ago as a potential threat to our economy, our security, our way of life. Things have certainly changed. The pervasive fear across the United States of America, and frankly for much of the world 8 or 9 years ago, was the fear of bombs, explosive devices, commercial airliners turned into missiles. We really didn't think too much about a cyber threat. The concept of attacks within the virtual world that could bring supply chains and services to a standstill or cripple critical infrastructure wasn't triggering the same alarm bells within the business community of the globe, within governments, and certainly not within the general public. Well, today at this summit, I'd like to join you in sounding the alarm. There's a lot of work to do. I can recall shortly after my appointment by the President, I attended a much-admired figure, a roast of a much-admired figure in American television. Some of you may be familiar with him. There's the late, great 60 Minutes producer, Don Hewitt. Gave a speech, tried to make some jokes, sat down, and soon Don stood up and he said, "Mr. Secretary, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be protecting us from Armageddon. You need to get home, get some rest, and I'm going to tuck you into bed personally." For the record, he did not. But I think I knew what he meant. To a certain extent, in the eyes of some, I was kind of the alarm bell guy. I was the point person on terrorism, at least publicly, and I often gave serious, sobering news to my fellow countrymen. But let me be clear about how this country confronts the global scourge of terrorism and how I think the world must confront the risk we face every day, be they physical or cyber. We shall not be breathless about it. We shall not live our lives alarmed. But we must understand those risks and do our best to eliminate as many as possible. And then we just have to manage the rest. I think your very presence at this summit confirms you understand the need to respond to the threat, and you share a sense of urgency about turning our mutual concerns into collective action. If so, then you believe, as I do, that when it comes to our readiness to protect ourselves from cyber attacks, we are not prepared. We're not even close to ready. I know you did some polling. One of the questions I might have asked was, how would you rate your community, your country, or the global community on a readiness scale of 1 to 10? 2? 5? How would you rate it? You need to think about that, all of us. As the International Pathways to Cybersecurity document pointed out, it's been a challenge to simply agree on the definition of cybersecurity. We've even heard some allusions to the cross-cultural differences, driving on the right, driving on the left. Some people like to call it cybersecurity. Others simply want to call it information security. And that's just, bottom line, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've got a lot of work to do. We can't allow the complexity of the challenges to immobilize us, because each day that the global community fails to act, we allow these intruders, these criminals, these malcontents to push our interconnected world closer to those disruptive events and catastrophic events we all seek to prevent. There was a time in the early days of computing that the scare that elicited the most passion was when the document you'd been working on for hours evaporated from the screen. We were worried about losing data. Our concerns are much deeper now, aren't they? So let's ask ourselves, what is it going to take for all of us to make the commitment to establish unambiguous parameters that define acts of international cybercrime or cyber warfare? Will it take a cyber tsunami? Will it take a cyber 9/11 to define what parameters constitute an act of war or acts of aggression? And if we can't attribute a cyber attack to a particular source, individual, organization, or country, what will be the response? And who will respond? What lines are we going to draw that will define what cyber attacks even warrant retaliation? And what constitutes a justifiable and appropriate response? And who will retaliate? And what of the cyber criminal? Where's the hacker if found to be tried? Will we have international rules of extradition? What's the appropriate course of action? What should the penalties be? What are the consequences? And without consequences, and as importantly, the will of the international community to enforce them, we will continue to be unwitting enablers of cyber criminals, terrorists, and yes, even nation states that will push the limits and ultimately use the internet to commit indefensible acts. Now, we certainly can't make these determinations unless everyone involved has a seat at the table, and that's something the East-West Institute has done very effectively during the past couple of days. Let me put an exclamation point on that. By that I mean, along with governments, we must include the private sector in very significant ways. I must say, based on my experience as Secretary of Homeland Security, just getting the private sector engaged in some of these important discussions when you had to deal with antitrust laws, ethical laws, rules of disclosure, it's difficult to pull people in an appropriate way, but I think it's about time that this country and other countries figured out how to do it. Because at the end of the day, generally we tend to think that policymaking should be made government